Without a doubt, the ACT reading test is a pretty difficult test. And today what I want to do is break down the way that the ACT, maybe other test preparers, break down the ACT reading test and kind of call it into question. So let me take a little bit of a step back and explain what I mean. So parents of sons or daughters who are pretty good readers, and even obviously these high school students themselves who have gotten good grades in English, like I said, they're good readers. Maybe they always do their reading assignments and things. They're sometimes perplexed because their ACT reading score is down here, and maybe their math score, and they're really not that great at math, might be kind of up here, and so it seems pretty contradictory. And so what we need then, obviously, is some kind of a solution that's going to bridge that gap between their reading base, if you will, their reading skills, and this score that's showing up on the ACT reading test. So to that end, what I want to do today is not present a comprehensive ACT reading strategy, we'll save that for later, but really how the questions themselves break down and how to categorize them. And by this, I specifically mean, how do other test preparers, other ACT prep experts out there, companies really, like the ACT itself, or maybe other big ones like Kaplan or Mometrics, how do these companies break down or categorize the questions themselves in the ACT reading test versus how do I do it? Because as you might have guessed, I tend to think that my methods, built up over thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of preparing students and researching and writing, tend to be a little bit more in line with what students actually need. So let's start with the ACT itself. So the ACT, of course, has this extremely best-selling ACT prep book. And what's good about this book actually is that it has lots of practice tests in it. Their analysis of things, I think, is a little too academic for students to really put into practice and help them. And I'll show you what I mean. So the ACT reading test has 40 questions. And the ACT, I'm on the page open to their ACT reading, categorizing. So they break down every single question into 8 or so categories. They have these kind of bigger categories and these smaller categories. Categories like identifying and interpreting details, determining the main idea of paragraphs, understanding comparative relationships, understanding cause and effect relationships, make generalizations, determine the meaning of words from context, understand sequences of events, analyze the author's voice and method. And so they put every single question into one of these categories, and then they give examples of these different categories at play. So here's kind of my fundamental question. How will a student, presuming a student is using this book, if a student memorizes these question types and these categories and even practices them, how are they going to develop the skills that they need to bridge that gap between the ACT reading test and their score and getting more questions right? What I'm saying is that these categories are so academic. And by that I mean, if someone out there is an ACT prep expert or something like myself and they're creating practice tests, maybe they themselves want to make sure that certain numbers of questions fall into these categories and that kind of a thing. But what are the skills that are tied to memorizing these categories that's going to result in more correct bubbles being bubbled in on test day? Here's another book that I just happen to have handy right here, and this one's by Mometrics. And when you get to the reading test, they've got all these categories in a similar way. Summarizing a complex text, paraphrasing, identifying the logical conclusion. We could go on and on. Inferences, directly stated information, implications, topics and main ideas, supporting details, topic and summary sentences. I could just keep flipping the pages and going through all these categories that Mometrics has. And I would be a big fan of these categories and all this stuff if they were tied to individual skills that result in more bubbles being correctly bubbled in on test day, but they're not. They're just academic. So in the ACT reading system or the ACT system, I break down all ACT reading questions into 3 categories. That's it. These categories aren't designed to make me sound smart. They aren't designed to give a student a false sense of improvement. Instead, they're just based on the skills that are necessary to get more questions right, and it's that simple. So what are these 3 categories? The first one is what I call micro, meaning really small, The second one is what I call medium. And the third category is what I call macro, or bigger picture. And probably in the future, I'm going to have individual videos about these 3 types of questions. I'll take you through some examples and some example passages that I've created that test these individually in my books, the ACT system or the ACT reading system, and I'll link to those in the description below. So maybe you can practice these categories individually, departed from, full-length practice tests, though those are in there as well. So I'll have videos on those things in the future, but for now, I want to just go over, give you a brief overview of these 3 categories and what they mean. So let's start with what I call micro questions. Micro in this case doesn't mean that the question is small. It doesn't mean that the answers are small. It refers instead to this: how much information does the student need to find to get this question correct? Okay, so they read the passage, they go to the questions. And then my categories are: how much information does the student need to find to get this question correct? Okay, how much information do they need to reference to get this question correct? Do they need to go back and reread entire paragraphs? Or instead, do they need to reread maybe one sentence and find a particular detail? That's what micro refers to. Micro questions, which require a student to find the correct sentence or two in the passage to get the question correct, because out of these 10 questions that are following any passage, 9 of them or 8 of them are going to be found directly in the passage. It's pretty clear and it's there. You just got to find it. So these micro questions that require reference to a sentence or two, these questions comprise 40 to 45% of all ACT reading questions. Think of it like this: a student reads a question, and then they really need to pull out, I guess if I had a symbol for this, it'd be a magnifying glass. And they need to go back to the passage and find where this detail is verified in the passage, or where they can find the detail that's going to help them get this question correct. It's micro because the amount of information you have to reference is very little. It's a sentence or two. And if you know anything about the ACT reading strategy that I profess and teach called annotating with active reading, they're going to have written in the margins these little passage maps or summaries of paragraphs that can help them locate where they need to be looking for these details in the first place. An example question in this category would be something like this: one difference, or maybe according to the passage, one overlooked difference between alligators and crocodiles is which of the following? So that question is requiring a student to find a very specific detail. They got to go back and find it. The second category of question, which I mentioned earlier, is what I called medium. And kind of like the micro questions, these kinds of questions comprise roughly 40 to 45% of all ACT reading questions. So now we're on the really tied for first place, the most important type of question, which is tied to the most important type of skill. And when I call this a medium question, what I mean is that these questions require the skill of going back, rereading a paragraph, sometimes 2 paragraphs, but that's a little more rare, usually rereading up to about an entire paragraph, analyzing it properly, then going back and answering the question correctly. Sometimes with this passage map, this annotating that I mentioned a second ago, and I've got a video about that, I'll link to that below as well. But sometimes with this passage map that they've created, they've already summarized these paragraphs really well, and they might not even need to spend the time rereading entire paragraphs, but nevertheless, the question references a medium amount of information, which is a paragraph or 2. An example question in this category will be something like: the primary function of the third paragraph is to, and then they have to figure out which of these 4 options is the primary function of the third paragraph. Well, that requires the student to go back and reread the third paragraph in context, a medium amount of information. And then lastly, there are what I called macro questions. These kinds of questions, they comprise roughly 15%, or the remaining questions after medium and micro, about 15% of all questions in the ACT reading test, 1 or 2 per passage out of the 10. And these questions are called macro because they require reference to the passage as a whole. So in this case, these kinds of questions, it's not really possible to go back and reread the passage to get these questions correct. Hopefully, in initial reading, paying attention to the big picture, not getting hung up on all the details, is going to be good enough for a student to get this question correct. However, it does require reference to the passage as a whole, and that's its own kind of skill. Reading the passage initially, thinking about the main ideas of the paragraphs, not getting hung up on details, so they have that bigger picture, picture or image to help them get these kinds of questions correct in the first place. And an example question in this category would be something like: it can most reasonably be inferred that the author of this passage has a knowledge of cave art that can best be described as, and so it's asking about the author's knowledge as a whole based on this whole passage. So in closing, let's keep it really simple. 3 categories for 3 skills. If I wanted to, I could go into the ACT reading test and break it down into 40 categories, one for every single question, but instead, the micro question requires the micro skill of finding the right 1 or 2 sentences. The medium category requires the medium skill of finding 1 or 2 paragraphs, rereading them and analyzing them properly. And the macro category requires the macro skill of, when reading the passage in the first place, not getting hung up or clinging to every single detail, but instead paying attention to the bigger picture of every single individual paragraph, and thus to the passage as a whole, so we're in the best position to get these questions correct. And all of this, of course, depends upon having the time to do this, which is why There is an ACT reading strategy about active reading. We can talk about that later. But for now, let's keep the categories simple because the skills are simple. And the skills are what are needed to actually improve an ACT reading score. So for the ACT system, I'm Philip Martin. Thank you so much, and God bless.